Chapter 21 of the renewal of the great attack and how it fared. Douglas had been decidedly put out by the death of his wife. After all, she had been a sort of habit, a useful drudge when all was said. Besides, he missed acutely the pleasures of torturing her. His suspicions of the bona fides of Balloch were conjoined with actual annoyance. It was at this painful moment in his career that Cremers came to the rescue. A widowed friend of hers had left a daughter in her charge, for Cremers had the great gift of inspiring confidence. This daughter was being educated in a convent in Belgium. The old woman immediately telegraphed for her and presented her to Douglas with the compliments of the season. Nothing could have been more timely or agreeable. She was a gentle, innocent child, as pretty and charming as he had ever seen. It was a great point in the game of the astute Cremers to have pleased the sorcerer, and she began insensibly to gain ascendancy over his spirit. He had at first suspected her of being an emissary of his colleague A.B., who might naturally wish to destroy him. For the plan of the sorcerer who wishes to be sole and supreme is to destroy all rivals, enemies, and companions, while the magician attains supremacy in unity by constantly uniting himself with others and finding himself equally in every element of existence. It is the difference between hate and love. He had been careful to examine her magically, and found no trace of A.B. in her aura. On the contrary, he concluded that her ambition was to supplant A.B., and that went well with his own ideas. But first he must get her into his 14, and have a permanent hold over her. She, on the other hand, appeared singularly desirous of making herself a treasure to him. She knew the one torment that gnawed continually at his liver, the hate of Cyril Grey, and she proposed to herself to win him wholly by offering that gentleman's scalp. She sharpened her linguistic tomahawk. One fine day in April she tackled him openly on the subject. "Say, great one, you and I got to have another peck at that spirit writing. Seems to me that was a fool's game down there." She jerked her head towards the river. "And I don't say but what you have done right about Balloch." Douglas glanced at her sharply in his most dangerous mood. How much did she know of a certain recent manoeuvre? But she went on quite placidly. "Now look here. We've got to get these guys, and we've got to get them where they live. You've been hitting at their strong point. Now I'll tell you something. That girl, she lived 5 years with Lavinia King, done her. I see that bright daughter of Terrascore only 5 minutes. But she didn't leave one mortal hanging on me, no sir. Now see here, big chief, you've been beating the water for them fish, and natural off they goes. For the land's sake, looky here, I've got to look after this business, and all I need is just one hook and line, and a pail full of bait, and if I don't land her, never trust me no more. Ain't I somebody always? Didn't I down old Blavatsky? Sure I did, and ain't this like eating pie after that?" The sorcerer deliberated with himself a while. Then he consulted his familiar demons. The omens were confusing. He thought that perhaps he had put his question ambiguously, and tried again in other words. He had begun by asking vaguely whether Cremers would succeed in her mission, which had earned him a very positive yes, flanked by a quite unintelligible message about deception, the false Dimitri, and the wrong horse. Also some apparent nonsense about Scotland and an island. This time he asked whether Cremers would succeed in luring Lisa to her destruction. This time the answer was more favourable, though tremulous. But ever since his wife's death, his demons had behaved very strangely. They seemed the prey of hesitation, and even of fear. Such as it was, however, their voice now jumped with his own convictions, and he agreed to her proposal. They spent the evening merrily in torturing a cat by blinding it, and then squirting sulphuric acid on it from a syringe, and in the mornings Cremers, with Abdul Bey for bait, set about her journey to Naples. Arrived in that favoured spot, she bade Abdul Bey enjoy the scenery and hold his peace. She would warn him when the hour struck. For Cremers was a highly practical old person. She was not like St. James's devils, who believe and tremble. She disbelieved, but she trembled all the same. She hated truth, because the truth sets men free, and therefore makes them happy, but she had too much sense to shut her eyes to it. and though she doubted the causes of magic and scoffed at all spiritual theory, she could not deny the effects. It was no idle boast of hers that she had destroyed Madame Blavatsky. Together with another woman, she had wormed her way into the big-hearted Theosophist's confidence and betrayed her foully at the proper moment. She had tried the same game on another adept, but when he found out, and she knew it, he had merely continued his kindnesses. The alternative before her was repentance or brain fever, and she had chosen the latter. Her disbelief in magic left her with its correlate, a belief in death. It was the one thing she feared, besides magic itself. But she did not make the mistake of being in a hurry on that account. The strength of her character was very great in its own way, and she possessed infinite reserves of patience. She played the game with no thought of the victory, and this is half the secret of playing most games of importance. To do right for its own sake is righteousness, though if you apply this obvious truth to art, the Philistine calls you names and your morals in question. Cremers was a genuine artist in malice. She was not even glad when she had harmed a friend and benefactor, however irreparably. Nothing could ever make her glad, but she was contented with herself on such occasions. She felt a sort of sense of duty done. She denied herself every possible pleasure. She hated happiness in the abstract in a generally Puritan spirit, and she objected to eat a good dinner herself as much as to consent that anyone else should eat it. Her principal motive in assisting Abdul Bey to his heart's desire was the cynical confidence that Lisa was capable of pouring him out a hell broth at least 40% above proof. The summer was well begun. The sun had turned towards the southern hemisphere once more. He had entered the sign of the lion, and with fierce and noble heat scarred the dry slopes of Posillipo. Ilio spent most of her time on the terrace of the Moon at her needlework, watching the ships as they sailed by, or by the peasants at their labour on their pastimes. It was a little before sunset on the 1st of August. She was leaning over the wall of the terrace. Sister Clara had gone up to the house to make ready for the adoration of the setting of the sun. Up the uneven flagstones of the lane below toiled the old fishwife with her burden, and looked up with the usual cheery greeting. At that moment the crone slipped and fell. "I'm afraid I've hurt my back," she cried with an adjuration to some saint. "I can't get up." Ilio, whether she understood the Italian words fully or no, could not mistake the nature of the accident. She did not hesitate. In a moment she had lowered herself from the wall. She bent down and gave her hand to the old woman. "Say," said the woman in English, "that boy's just crazy about you, and he's the loveliest man on God's earth. Won't you say one word to him?" Lisa's jaw dropped in amazement. "What? Who?" she stammered. "Why, that perfect sweet Turk, Abdul. Sure you know him, dearie." Cremers was watching Lisa's face. She read the answer. She gave a low whistle, and round the corner Abdul Bey came running. He took Lisa in his arms and rained kisses passionately on her mouth. She had not thought of resistance. The situation entranced her. The captive princess, the intrigue, the fairy prince. Every syllable was a poem. "I've longed for you every hour for months," she cried between his kisses. "Why, oh, why didn't you come for me before?" She had no idea that she was not telling the truth. The past was wiped clean out of her mind by the swirl of the new impulse, and once outside the enchanted circle of the garden, her vow in tatters, there was nothing to remind her. "I am here now." The words burst like explosions from his lips. "Come, I've got a yacht waiting. Take me, oh, take me where you will." Cremers was on his feet, spry and businesslike. "We're best out of here," she said. "Let's beat it." Taking Lisa's arms, she and Abdul hurried down the steps which led to the shore road. Brother Onofrio's patrol witnessed the scene. He took no notice. It was not against that contingency that he was armed, but at the summons to the adoration he reported the event to his superior. Brother Onofrio received the news in silence and proceeded to perform the ceremony of the salutation. An hour later, as supper ended, the sound of the bell rang through the house. The visitor was Simon If. He found Cyril dressed in everyday clothes, no more in his green robe. The boy was smoking a cigar upon the terrace where he'd read his poem on the day after Walburgis night. He did not rise to greet his master. Tell the praetor that you have seen Caius Marius, a fugitive, seated upon the ruins of Carthage, he exclaimed. Don't take it so hardly, boy, cried the old mystic. The man who makes no mistakes makes nothing. But it is my duty to reprove you, and we'd better get it over. Your whole operation was badly conceived. In one way or another it was bound to fail. You select a woman with no moral strength, not even with that code of convention which helps so many weak creatures through their temptations. I foresaw from the first that sooner or late she would throw up the experiment. Your words touched me the more deeply because I also foresaw it from the first. Yet you went on with it. Oh, no, Cyril's eyes were half closed. What do you mean, oh, no? Cried the other sharply. He knew his Cyril like a book. I never even began, murmured the boy dreamily. You will be polite to explain yourself. Simon's lips took a certain grimness of grip upon themselves. This telegram has consoled me in my grief, said Cyril, taking with languid grace a slip of paper from his pocket. It came last week. Simon If turned it towards the light. Horatii, he said. A code word, I suppose, but this is dated from Iona, from the holy house where himself is. Himself was the word used in the order to designate its head. Yes, said Cyril softly. I was fortunate enough to interest himself in the experiment, so Sister Cybele has been there under the charge of the Mahavarya Fang. You young devil! It was the first time that simple Simon had been startled in 40 years. So you arranged this little game to draw the enemy's fire. Naturally, the safety of Sister Cybele was the first consideration. And Horatii? It's not a code word. I think it must be Roman history. 3 boys. Rather a lot, isn't it? They'll be needed, said Simon grimly. I've been doing magic too. Do tell me. The quest of the Golden Fleece, Cyril. I've been sowing the dragon's teeth, you remember? Armed men sprung to life and killed each other. But I don't see any armed men. You will? Haven't you seen the papers? I never see papers. I'm a poet. I like my lies the way Mother used to make them. Well, Europe's at war. I have got your old commission back for you with an appointment as intelligence officer on the staff of Colonel Cripps. It sounds like anarchism. From each according to his powers, each according to his needs, you know. By the way, what's it about, anything? The people think it's about the violation of solemn treaties and the rights of the little nations and so on. The governments think it's about commercial expansion, but I, who made it know that it is the baptism of blood of the new aeon. How could we promulgate the law of liberty in a world where freedom has been strangled by industrialism? Men have become such slaves that they submit to laws which would have made a revolution in any other country since the world begun. They have registration cards harder to bear than iron fetters. They allow their tyrants to bar them from every pleasure that even their poverty allows them. There is only one way to turn the counter-jumper into a Curtius, and the factory girl into a Cornelia, and I have taken it. How did you work it? It has been a long business, but as you know, Sir Edward is a mystic. You saw that article on fishing, I suppose. Oh yes, I knew that, but I didn't know it was more definite. It was he did it, but he'll lose his place. He's too fire-minded, and in a year they'll clamour for fanatics. It's all right. They'll butt each other's brains out, and then the philosophers will come back and build up a nobler type of civilization. I think you accused me recently of using strong medicine. I was practising British hypocrisy on you. I had to see the Prime Minister that week. Excuse me if I answer a humorist according to his humour. I want to show you how necessary this step has been. Observe, the bourgeoisie is the real criminal always. I'm with you there. Look at the testimony of literature. In the days of chivalry, our sympathies go with the knight-errant who redresses wrongs, with the king, whose courage and wisdom deliver his people from their enemies. But when kingship became tyranny and feudalism oppression, we took our heroes from the rebels. Robin Hood, Hero of the Wake, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Rob Roy. It was always the underdog that appealed to the artist. Then industrialism became paramount, and we began, in Byron's time, to sympathise with brigands and courtiers. Presently these were wiped out, and today, or rather the day before yesterday, we were reduced to loving absolute scoundrels, Arsène Lupin, Raffles, Stingery, Fantomas, and 100 others, or the detectives who, although on the side of society, were equally occupied in making the police look like fools. That is the whole charm of Pierre What's-his-name in Gabourey, and Dupin, and Sherlock Holmes. There has never been a really sympathetic detective in fiction who was on good terms with the police. And you must remember that the artist always represents the subconscious will of the people. The literary hack who panders to the bourgeoisie and makes his heroes of millionaires' sons has never yet created a character, and never will. Well, when the people love a burglar and hate a judge, there's something wrong with the judges. But what are you doing here in a world crisis? I'm over here to buy Italy. Bolin bought Belgium, some time back. He was thick with Leopold, but the old man had too much sense to deal. He knew he would be the first to go smash when the war came. But Albert pocketed the good red gold without a second thought. That's partly what the trouble is over. Germany found out about it. And why buy Italy? To keep Austria busy, I suppose. These wops can hardly hope to force the line, especially with the Trentino salient on the flank. That's the idea. It would have been better and cheaper to buy Bulgaria, but Grey wouldn't see it. There's the eternal fear of Russia to remember. We're fighting against both sides in the Balkans, and that makes Russia half-hearted and endangers the whole entity. But it doesn't matter so long as enough people are killed. The survivors must have elbow room for their souls, and the memory of heroic deeds and the lives of them and theirs to weigh against the everlasting pall of material welfare. When those men come back from a few years in the trenches, they'll make short work of the pious person that informs them of the wickedness of smoking and eating meat and drinking beer and being out after 11 o'clock at night and kissing a girl and reading novels and playing cards and going to the theatre and whistling on the Sabbath. I hope you're right. You're old, which tends, I suppose, to make you optimistic. In my young years there always rings the screams of terror of the slave when you offer to strike off his fetters. All of Europe will be scream and stench for years to come, but the new generation will fear neither poverty nor death. They will fear weakness. They will fear dishonour. It is a great programme. Qui vivra verra. He who lives will see. Meanwhile, I suppose I report to Colonel Cripps. You will meet him, running hard, I expect, somewhere in France. It will be a fluke if Paris is saved. As you know, it always takes England 3 years to put her boots on. If we had listened to the men who knew, like Bobbs, and fixed up an army of 3 million, there could have been no war, at least not in this particular tangle of alliances. There would have been a social revolution, more likely, an ignoble business of greed against greed, which would have left men viler and more enslaved than ever. As it is, the masses on both sides think they are fighting for ideals. Only the governments know what hypocrisy and sham it is, so the ideals will win, both in defeat and victory. Man, only 3 days ago France was the France of Panama and Dreyfus, and Madame Hubert, and Madame Steinhau, and Madame Calliope, and today she is already the France of Roland and Henri Quarter, and Danton and Napoleon and Gambetta and Joan of Arc. And England of the Boer Wars and the Irish massacres, and the Marconi scandals and Tranby Croft. Oh, give England time. She'll have to be worse before she's better. Talking of time, I must pack up if I'm to catch the morning train for the land of hope and glory. The train service is disorganised. I came from Toulon in a destroyer. It should take you back there. Jack Manners is in command. Report at Toulon to the O.C. You'd better start in half an hour. I'll see you safe on board. My car's at the door, and here's your commission. Cyril Grey thrust the document into his pocket, and the 2 men went up into the house. An hour later they were aboard the destroyer. They shook hands in silence. Simon If went down the gangway, and Manners gave the word. As they raced northward, they passed under the lee of Abdul's yacht, where Lisa, up to the eyes in champagne, was fondling her new lover. Her little pig-like eyes sparkled through their rolls of fat. Her cheeks, the colour and consistency of ripe camembert cheese, sagged pendulous upon a many-chinned neck, which looked almost goetous, and the whole surmounted one of these figures, dear to engineers, because they afford endless food for speculation as to the means of support. The moon was now exercising her full influence, totally unchecked and unbalanced, and the woman's nature being wholly of the body, with as little brain in proportion as the rhinoceros. The effect was seen shortly, mostly on the physical plane. Her mind was a mere swamp of succulent luxury, so she sat there and swayed and swallowed over Abdul Bey. Kremers thought she looked like a snowman just beginning to melt. With a sardonic grin, the old woman waved her hand and went on deck. The yacht was now well out in the open air on her way to Marseilles. Herr Kremers was to be landed so that she might return to Paris to report her success to Douglas, while the lovers went on their honeymoon. The wind blew fresh from the southwest, and Kremers, who was a good sailor, came as near as she ever could to joy as she felt the yacht begin to roll, and pictured the tepid ice-cream heroine of romance in the saloon. Meanwhile, the destroyer, her nose burrowing into the sea like a ferret slipped into a warren, drove passionately towards Toulon. The keenness and ecstasy of Cyril's face was so intense that Manners rallied him about it. "I thought you were one of the all men are brothers crowd," he said, "yet you're as keen as mustard to slay your cousin German." "Puns," replied Cyril, "are the torpedo boat destroyers of the navy of wit. Consider yourself crushed. Your matchless intelligence has not misled you as to my views. All men are brothers. As a magician, I embrace, I caress, I slobber over the cheeks of Bloody Bill. But fighting in the army is not a magical ceremony. It is the senseless, idiotic performance of a numbskull, the act, in a word, of a gentleman. And as to my lasting shame, I happen to be born in that class. I love to do it. Be reasonable. It's no pleasure to me, as an immortal god, to sneeze. I refuse to render myself a laughing stock to the other Olympians by such indignity. But when my body has a cold in its head, it is proper for it to blow its nose. I do not approve, much less participate, and my body is therefore the more free to act according to its nature, and it blows its nose much harder than it would if I took a hand. That is the advantage of being a magician. All one's different parts are free to act with the utmost possible vigour according to their own natures, because the other parts do not interfere with them. You don't let your navigators into the stoke-hole, or your stokers into the chart-house. The first art in a depth-ship is to get your elements sorted out and specialised and organised and disciplined. Here endeth the first lesson. I think I'll turn in. It's a bit beyond me, Cyril. All I know is that I'm willing to risk my life in a good cause. But it's a rotten bad cause. We have isolated Germany and hemmed her in for years, exactly as we did a century ago with Napoleon. Wilhelm, who wanted peace because he was getting fat on it, knew us for his real enemy. In '99 he came within an ace of uniting Europe against us, at the time of the Fushidi incident, but we baffled him, and since then he has been getting deeper in every moment. He tried again over the Boer War. He tried threats. He tried diplomacy. He tried everything. The Balkan War and the Agdia incident showed him his utter helplessness. The Kingdom of Albania, the war in Tripoli proved that he could no longer rely on Italy, and when Russia resorted to so shameless an assassination as that of Sarajevo, my dear good man, England has been a pirate as she always was. From Hengist and Horsa and the Vikings, she first learned the trick. William the Conqueror was a pirate, so was Francis Drake. Look at Morgan, whom we knighted, and all the other buccaneers. Look at our system of privateering. Ever heard of the Alabama? We learnt the secret of sea power. We can cut the alimentary canal of any nation in Europe, bar Switzerland and Russia. Hence our fear of Russia. It's the Jolly Roger you should fly. Jack Manners. We stood all Germany's expansion. We said we were her cousins. But when she started a navy, that was another barrel of fish. I don't think I can hear this, you know. Cheer up, I'm one of the pirate crew. Oh, you're Captain Kidd? I've already stated my opinion as to the conversational value of puns. I'm going to turn in. You get busy and find a neutral ship to rob. I shall do my best to maintain the law of the sea. Made by the pirate to suit his game. Good God, I can't see why we shouldn't be sensible. Why must we invoke law and gospel every time we want to do a dirty act? My character's strong enough to let me kill all the Germans. I can without persuading myself that I'm saving them from Prussian tyranny. Good night. The youth is unintelligible or immoral, thought Manners as he turned his face to the spindrift. But I bet he kills a lot of Germans. Chapter 22 of a certain dawn upon our old friend the Boulevard Arago, and of the loves of Lisa la Giaffria and Abdul Bey, how they prospered, of the conclusion of the false alarm of the great experiment, and of a conference between Douglas and his subordinate. Lord Anthony Boleyn was one of 3 men in the War Office who could speak French perfectly. Despite this drawback, he had been selected to confer with the French headquarters in Paris. Here he met Cyril Grey, busy with his tailor. The young magician had once held a captaincy in a hussar regiment, but a year of India had developed his native love of strange places and peoples. He had been tempted to resign his commission and yielded. He had gone exploring in Central Asia and the deadly districts beyond Assam. He could not stand gymkhanas, polo and flirtation. Simon If had given him a hint now and again of what magic might effect if a war came, and the boy had profited. He had formed provisional plans. He encountered Lord Anthony by chance one evening on the Boulevard des Italiens, dined him, and on finding that all amusements, even that of watching the world from the terrace of a café, were to end by order of the military governor of Paris at 8 o'clock, suggested that they should spend the evening smoking opium chez Ziz, a delightful girl who lived with a brilliant young English journalist on the Boulevard Marcel. At midnight, serenely confident that God was in his heaven, as asserted by the late Robert Browning, they decided to finish the night at Cyril's studio. Here the young magician reconstructed the crime of the jumping balls of the mysterious countess, and recounted the episode of the thing in the garden, to the delectation of the merman of Mayfair. He then offered to amend Boleyn's coat of arms by the introduction of 12 prawns couchant, gulls, gartered azure, and the substitution of poltergeists for the wild men of the ducal estuary. Modestly disclaiming these heraldic glories, Lord Anthony regaled his host with an ingenious account of a Swedish gentleman who materialized the most voluminous spectres from, as subsequently appeared in circumstances which can only be qualified as dramatic, the contents of a steel cylinder measuring 12 inches in length and 3 in diameter, which a search of the medium stripped to the buff had at first failed to disclose. But neither was honestly interested in his own remarks. The subconscious excitement of the war made all conversation on any other topic sound miserably artificial. Boleyn's story made them both distrait. They fell into a heavy silence, pondering methods of concealing dispatches or detecting spies. Investigation of spiritualism makes a capital training ground for Secret Service work. One soon gets up to all the tricks. Presently Cyril Grey began to preach magic. Germany was on a pretty good wicket, he said. She is at war. We have only taken a holiday to go fighting. The first condition of success in magic is purity of purpose. One must let no other consideration interfere with the business in hand. But we are hypocrites in England, consequently we compromise and fumble. When a magician does get in charge of an affair, all goes pretty well. Look how Simple Simon has isolated Germany. Even there he has been thwarted by the Exchequer. 5 millions in the right place would have bought the Balkans. How much do you think that little economy will cost us before we're through? As for the foolishness of leaving Turkey doubtful, it's beyond all words. Yes, agreed Boleyn, we ought to have supported Abdul Hamid from the first. The best kind of Englishman is blood brother to the best kind of Mussulman. He's brave, just, frank, manly, and proud. We should always be in alliance with Islam against the servile Hindus and so-called Christians. Where is the spirit of the Paladins and the Templars and the Knights of the Round Table? The modern Christian is the bourgeoisie, whose character is based on fear and falsehood. There are 2 kinds of animals, mainly, one whose defence is obscurity, shunning death, avoidance of danger, the other whose defence is attack. Yes, we're all right so long as we make ourselves feared, but Victorian prudery turned our tigers into oxen. We found that it was wrong to fight, dangerous to drink beer, wicked to love. Presently it was cruel to eat beef, immoral to laugh, fatal to breathe. We went in terror of the omnipresent germ. Hence we are fat, cowardly slaves. I hear that Kitchener is hard put to it to get his first 100,000 men. Only the public schools respond. Only gentlemen and sportsmen really love England, the people that have been cursed these last few years as tyrants and libertines. Only the men? And few there are in the crowd of Caniel, old women, slackers, valetudinarians, eaters of nuts. God rest the soul of Edward VII. I thought all would be well when Victoria died, but now... This is no hour of the night to lapse into poetry. Anyhow, Germany's nearly as bad, with her social democratic party. Do you think that? Cried Cyril sharply, sitting up. His gesture was indecipherably intense. It seemed utterly disproportionate to Bolin's casual commonplace. I know it. It's one of the chief causes of the war. The Sarburn incident showed that the Junkers, that they were safe only for a year or two. After that the people would start out to be too proud to fight, replied Anthony, anticipating a transpontine chameleon. And so? Cyril's voice trembled. A tense thrill ran through his body. He had become sober in an instant. The court party wanted war, to bring back the manly spirit to the nation, and incidentally to keep their place in the sun. The boy sank with a large sigh into his seat. His tone changed to its old supercilious slurring. Bloody Bill was afraid for his destiny. Scared green. Don't talk for 5 minutes, there's a good chap. I've a strange feeling come over me, almost as if I'm going to think. Lord Anthony obliged with silence. The 5 minutes became 20. Then Cyril spoke. I'd better get to Cripps double quick, said he. I'm his intelligence officer, and I think it my duty to inform him of the plans of the German Great General Staff. Yes, you should certainly do that, answered Lord Anthony, laughing. Then let's stroll up the boulevard. Dawn's breaking. We'll get a café brioche at the Rotand, and then I'll tyrannize my tailor and get off. They went out into the cold morning air. 300 yards away, outside the Santé prison, a small crowd had collected. The centre of attraction seemed to be a framework, 2 narrow uprights with a crossbar, where a triangular piece of metal glittered in the pale twilight. Peace hath her victories no less renowned than war, drawled Cyril cynically. Confess that I have entertained you royally. Here is a choice savoury to wind up after our feast. Lord Anthony could not conceal his horror and repulsion. He knew well enough what sight chance had prepared for them, but the fascination drew him far more surely than if his temperament had resembled that of his friend. They approached the crowd. A ring was kept about the framework by a cordon of police. Just then the gates of the prison opened, and a little procession came out. All eyes were drawn instantly to its central figure, an old man whose jaw was dropped, and from whose throat issued a hoarse howling, utterly monotonous and inhuman. His eyes were starting from his head, and their expression was not one to be described. His arms were bound tightly to his sides. 2 men were half supporting him, half pushing him. Save for his horrible cry, there was no sound. There was no movement in the crowd, no whisper. Like automata, the officials did their duty. In a trice, the prisoner was thrown forward onto a board, thrust up towards the framework. His caterwaul suddenly ceased. A moment later a sharp order rang out in the voice of one of the prison officials. The knife fell. From the crowd burst a most dreadful sound, an ah so low, so fierce that it had no human quality. Lord Anthony Boling could never be sure whether it was after that or before it that he heard the head tumble into the basket. "Who was it?" asked Cyril of the bystander. "An Anglaise," answered the man, "le Docteur Balloch." Cyril started back. He had not recognized his old enemy. But even at that moment he was accosted by one whom he would never fail to know, even dressed as he was in the uniform of a French colonel. Douglas. On his arm was a child whose eyes were blear already with debauchery, who staggered, her eyes rolling, her hair dishevelled, her mouth loose and wet, laughing with indecent and profane intoxication. "Good morning, Captain Grey. Well met indeed," began Douglas, obeying in his triumph. "I trust you passed a pleasant time in Naples." "Very pleasant," returned Grey. "Dr. Balloch," continued Douglas, "crossed my path. I'm glad you should have seen the end of him." "I am glad," said Cyril. And what end do you think I have reserved for you? Said the sorcerer with sudden foam of ferocity. Something charming, I am sure, said Cyril silkily. I always admired your work, you know. That translation of the book of the sacred magic of Ambra Melin, the mage. In particular, you remember the passage about the wicked Anthony of Prague? He went on with sudden force and solemnity. The marvellous thing he did, and how he prospered, and how he was found by the roadside, his tongue torn out, and the dogs that feast upon his bowels. Do you know what has saved you so far? Only one bar between you and destruction, the love of your wife, whom you have murdered. With that Cyril cried aloud 3 words in a strange tongue, and giving the other no chance to reply, marched rapidly away with his friend. Douglas could not have recovered in any case. He was as one stunned. How did this boy know of the death of his wife? Well, that might be understood, but how did he know his most secret fear? The fact that since the crime his demons had lost their courage. He shook the feeling off and turned away to gloat over the death of Balak. "Who was that?" asked Bolin. "The Grand Panjadrum himself, with the little round button on top. That's Douglas. The Black Lodge man? Ex-man. I see daylight. Balak was condemned, you know, for a crime done 20 years ago. Douglas must have known about it and betrayed him. That's the regular thing. How does he come to be a colonel in the French army? Don't know. He was close in with 1 or 2 ministers. Becchiossu, I think in particular. There's a lot of politics in occultism, as you know. I'll think that over. I might ask the minister this morning, but I tell you it's no time for trifles. Ever since all the mobilization plans were scrapped by the failure of Liege and Lamotte to hold out, distraction has reigned supreme. No casual mistress, but a wife, and progress to the lords of hell at that. Do not quote Tennyson, even mixed under the shadow of the Lion de Belfort. As to trifles, there are none in war. Ask the Germans if you don't believe me. A little later, after the Ronton Café in the Boulevard Montparnasse had refreshed them with its admirable coffee, and those brioches which remind one of boyhood's earliest kisses, they walked down to the Place de la Concorde and parted. Cyril went on to the opera, to his tailor in the Rue de la Paix. His mind was full of meditations upon the details of the great ideas that had come to him, the divination of the enemy's objective. His suggestion had made Lord Antony laugh. He himself had never felt less like laughing. He was on fire with creative genius, and terrified lest his work should fall upon barren soil. Well he knew how hard it is to get the power to listen to the reason. At the corner of the Place de l'Opera he lifted his eyes to assure himself of a free crossing. The mind of Abdul Bey was in turmoil. His first night upon the yacht had been mere wallowing in debauch, but he woke with a clear head, acutely alive to the complexity of his situation. He was personally triumphant. There was nothing in his private affairs to worry him. But in charge as he was of the Turkish Secret Service in Paris, he knew the political situation well enough. He knew that Turkey would throw in her lot with Germany, sooner or later. And he was doubtful as to the wisdom of returning to France. On the other hand, duty called him with clarion voice, and he wanted to have as many fingers as possible in the pie. After much consideration, he thought he would land at Barcelona and get through with his American passport, for he had papers from most nations as a distracted millionaire. His companions, both American citizens, would aid the illusion. Supposing that there was already trouble or suspicion, this subterfuge would serve. Once in Paris, he could find out how the land lay and act accordingly. He gave orders to the captain to make for Catalonia. The voyage was uneventful, save for the brief visit of a cruiser which discovered nothing contraband. In fact, Abdul and Lisa remained drunk the whole time. Only just off the Spanish coast, a capful of wind once again interfered with Lisa's enjoyment of the honeymoon. It had another consequence more serious. No sooner had they landed at Barcelona than Lisa suddenly became terribly ill. After a week the doctors decided upon a radical remedy, operation. The next day a girl child entered the world, very much alive. Despite the irregularity of her entrance, no ordinary child either. She was a beautifully made baby, with deep blue eyes, and she was born with 4 teeth, and with hair 6 inches long, so fair as to be silvery white. Like a tattoo mark just over the heart was a faint blue crescent. Lisa recovered rapidly from her illness, but not too quickly for the amorous Turk, though he was surprised and annoyed to find that she had recovered her early grace and activity. The fat had gone from her in the 3 weeks of illness, and when she began to be able to move about and drive in the city, she looked once more almost as she did on the night when Cyril first saw her, a gay, buxom, vigorous woman. The change called Abdul's adieu, and her own feelings altered with it. Her lover's sloppiness began to disgust her. As to the child, it was a source of irritation to both of them. Cremers again was hardly a boon companion. She would have depressed a hypochondriac going to the funeral of a beloved uncle who had left him nothing. Before Lisa had been out of bed 3 days, a crisis arose. She felt instinctively that Paris would be no fun and wanted to go to America. Abdul felt that he must lose no time in getting to Paris. Cremers, for some reason, had changed her mind about reporting to Douglas. She was homesick for West 186th Street, so she said. The explosion came at lunch, the Spanish nurse having failed to muffle the baby with due adequacy. "Oh, hell," said Abdul Bey. "God knows I don't want the little beast," said its proud mother. "Look here," remarked Cremers, "I do want it, sure some baby." "Oh, hell," repeated Abdul Bey. "Look here, you give me the rocks and I'll take her across the pond. There's ships. Give me $3,000 and expenses and $3,000 every year and I'll fix it. You folks get off and paint Paris pink. Is it a go?" Abdul Bey brightened immediately. Only one thought chilled him. "What about Douglas?" he said. "I'll tend to that." "It's a good scheme," muttered Lisa. "Let's get away tonight. I'm sick of this hole." She caressed the Turk warmly. But Paris was no longer the Paris of her dreams, no longer the Paris of idleness and luxury where good Americans go when they die. It was a Paris of war, of stern discipline, of patriotic enthusiasm, nothing less than a nightmare for the compatriots of the lady who didn't raise her boy to be a soldier. She blamed Abdul, who shrugged his shoulders and reminded her that she was lucky to get dinner at all, that the Germans were likely to be in the city in a week or so. She taunted him. He let loose his ancestral feelings about women, those which lie deep buried in all of us who are at least not utterly degenerate in soul, however loose morality may have corrupted us upon the surface. She rose in the automobile just as they crossed the Place de l'Opéra and broke her parasol over his head, then turned her nails loose on his eyes. He fisted her in the abdomen, and she collapsed into the seat of the car with a scream. It was this that diverted the attention of Cyril Grey from his contemplation of the designs of Germany. The boy made a leap and had Abdul by the throat in a moment, dragging him out of the car and proceeding to administer a summary castigation with his boot. But the police interfered. 3 men rode up with drawn sabres and put an end to the affair. They arrested all parties, and Cyril Grey only escaped by the exhibition of that paper which had won him such respect months earlier on the shambles of Moray railway station. "I have to go to my tailor, service of the minister," he remarked with a cynical smile, and was dismissed with the profoundest respect. "After all, it was no business of mine," he muttered as he wriggled into his new tunic, to the immense admiration of the tailor, a class whose appreciation of manly beauty depends so largely upon the price of the suit. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. The trouble comes when you can't lose 'em. Poor old Lisa, poor old Abdul. Well, as I said, it's none of my business. My business is to divine the faults of the enemy and, oh Lord, how long, to get the powers that to be understood that I am right. Considering that they needed 8 million marching men to persuade them that Bloody Bill meant war, I fear that my task may be no sinecure." He went to the barracks where a military automobile was waiting for him, and told the chauffeur with bitter wit to go out to meet General Cripps. As to Lisa and the Turk, it was 24 hours before they were set at liberty. The sight of Cyril, his prompt intervention in her defence, relit the flames of her half-crazy passion. She rushed over to the studio to see him. It was shut up, and the concierge could give her no news. She drove wildly to the Professe house in Montmartre. There they told her that he had gone to join the British Army. Various excited inquiries in official quarters led her at last to Lord Anthony Boleyn. He was genuinely sympathetic. He had liked the girl at first sight, but he could hold out no hopes of arranging for her to see him. "There's only one way for you to get to the front," said he. "Join the Red Cross. My sister's here, forming a section. I'll give you a note to her if you like." Lisa jumped at the suggestion. She saw more vividly than if it was actual the obvious result. Cyril would be desperately wounded, leading the last victorious charge of the dragoons against the walls of Berlin. She would interestingly nurse him back to life, probably by means of transfusion of blood, then, raised to the peerage, Marshal Earl Grey of Cologne, where he had swum the Rhine, and tearing the keys of the city from the trembling hands of the astonished burgomaster, had flung them back across the river to his hesitating comrades, would lead her, with the Victoria Cross in gold and diamonds on his manly bosom, to the altar at St. Margaret's, Westminster. It was worth while learning magic to become clairvoyant like this. She dashed off, still at top speed, to enrol herself with Lady Marcia Bolin. She gave no further thought to Abdul. He would never have attracted her, had she not perceived a difficulty in getting him. As to that gentleman himself, if grief tore at his heartstrings, he showed it that night in an unusual way. It may have been but simulation of philosophical fortitude. There is no need to inquire. His actions are of more interest. They consisted of picking up a coquette on the Boulevard des Italiens and taking her to dinner at the Café de Paris. At the conclusion of a meal which would have certainly been prescribed as a grief cure to any but a dyspeptic, the maitre d'hotel approached their table and tendered with a bow an envelope. Abdul opened it. It was a summons from Douglas to appear immediately in his presence at the apartment in the Faubourg Street, Germain. The Turk had no choice but to comply. He excused himself to his fair guest, at the cost of 100-franc note, and drove immediately to the rendezvous. Douglas received him with extreme heartiness. "1,000 congratulations, dear young man, upon your brilliant victory. You have succeeded where older and more learned men failed badly. I called you here tonight to tell you that you are now eligible for a place in the 14, the Gargale, for a seat is vacant since this morning." "They executed Balloch?" Douglas nodded with a gloating smile. "But why did you not save him, master?" "Save him? It was I that destroyed him when he tried to betray me. Candidates take notice." Abdul protested his loyalty and devotion. "The supreme test," continued Douglas, "cannot conveniently be imposed in time of war. There is too much to do just now. But as a preliminary, how do you stand with Germany?" Abdul shrunk back, startled out of his presence of mind. "Germany?" he stammered at last. "Why, Colonel," he emphasized the title, "I know nothing. I have no instructions from my government." He met the eye of his master and read its chill contempt. "Dare you play with me?" The young man protested that no such thought had crossed his mind. "In that case," pursued the sorcerer, "you won't know what that means." Douglas took from his pocket a 50-franc note. The Turk caught it up, his eyes growing momentarily wider with surprise. "Examine it," said Douglas. The Turkish agent held it to the light. In the figures numbering the note were 2 small pinpricks. "Ah!" he cried. "Then you are—" "I am. You may as well know that my colleague in the lodge, A.B., is going to stir up trouble for the British in India. Her influence with certain classes of Hindus is very great. For your part, you may try discreetly to tamper with the Mussulman section of the French troops, the Africans. But be careful. There is more important work to your hand, no less than the destruction of the French armies in the field. Now let us see what you could do. I am going to send you to my little garden and hermitage, where I occasionally appear in the character of a great ascetic. There is an old lady there devoted to me. Have your best man there to play yogi. In the garden, here's the plan, in the terminal of a wire. There's another in that house where you got baptized and married, remember? Thence there's a cable up sign to another cottage where that old Belgian mystic lives, the friend of Maeterlinck. Ha! He's really von Walder, a Dresdener, and he's in charge of another cable, underground 300 miles, thanks to Biscuit, who helped us with the road squads, to a place which by now is firmly in the hands of the Crown Prince. So all you have to do is tell your man to sit and pretend to meditate and tap, I shall send you plenty of information from the front. You will know my agents by a nick filled in a trouser button. Each message will give a number, so that you will know if any go astray. All clear? Admirable. I need not say how proud I am to find that we are on the same side. I was very frightened of that uniform. Le habitat ne fait pas l'homme, replied Douglas gaily. The clothes don't make the man. And now, sir, let us spend the night discussing our plans in detail and some very excellent whisky which I happen to have by me. The spies pursued their double task with pitiless energy till morning was well broken. Later in the day Douglas left for Soissons. He was attached to the French army as chief of a corps of signallers, thanks once again to the good officers of Bescul. His plans were perfect. They had been cut and dried for over 15 years. Chapter 23. Of the arrival of a Chinese god upon the field of battle, of his success with his superiors, and of a sight which he saw upon the road to Paris. Also of that which thereby came unto him, and the end of all those things whose event begat a certain beginning. Unmatched in history is the retreat of the British army from Mons. It was caught unprepared. It had to fight 3 weeks before it was ready. It was outnumbered 3-1 by a triumphant enemy. It was not coordinated with the French armies, and they failed to support it at critical moments. Yet it fought that awful dogged fight from house to house and field to field through league on league of northern France. The line was forced to lengthen constantly as the retreat continued. It was attenuated by that and by its losses to beyond any human breaking point. But luckily for England, her soldiers are made of such metal that the thinner the wire is drawn, the tougher it becomes. However, there is a point at which open order is like the word décolleté, used to describe a smart American woman's dinner dress. And General Cripps was feeling it at the moment when his new intelligence officer presented himself. It was about 6 o'clock at night. Cripps and his staff were bivouacked in the mairie of a small village. They were contemplating a further retreat that night. "Sit down, Captain Grey," said the chief kindly. "Join me for dinner, just as soon as we can get these orders out. Listen, and you'll pick up the outlines. We'll talk after dinner on the road." Cyril took a chair. To his delight, an aide-de-camp, Lord Juventus Mellor, an exquisite young dandy with a languid lisp, who in time of peace had been pupil and private secretary of Simon If, came to greet him. "Ju, dear boy, help me out. I've got to tell Cripps something, and he'll think I'm mad. It's bluff, too, but it's true for all that, and it's the one chance in the world." "Right-o." "Are we retreating again?" "All through the night. There's not a dog's chance to save Paris, and the line stretches every hour. Don't worry about Paris. It's as safe as Bordeaux. Safer, because the government is at Bordeaux." "My poor friend, wouldn't you be better in a home?" The British army had no illusions about its situation. It was a thin, drab line of heroes, very thin and very drab, but there was no doubt about the heroism, and no uncertainty about what would happen to it if the Germans possessed a leader with initiative. So far the hostile legions had moved according to the rules with all due scientific caution. A leader of temperament and intuition might have rushed that tenuous line. Still, science was as sure as it was as slow, and the whole army knew it. They prepared to die as expensively as possible, with simplicity of manhood. They had not yet heard that press and pulpit had made them the laughing-stock of the world by the invention of the ridiculous story of the Angels of Mons. Lord Juventus Mellor was something of a hero-worshipper. From Simon If he would have taken any statement with absolute respect, and Gray's remark had been somewhat of the Simon If brand. It was therefore almost as soon as impertinence as it was an absurdity. Paris was as certain to fall as the sun to set. It was in rotten bad taste to joke about it. "Look here," said Cyril, "I'm serious." "All the worse," retorted Mellor. "You really would be better in a home." "You wouldn't talk like that if we were discussing magic." "Too. Then you're an ass. I am talking magic, if you had only ears to hear." "How?" "Everything's a magical phenomena in the long run, but war's magic, from the word jump. Come now, therefore, and let us reason together, saith the Lord. I have done a divination by the tarot, by a method which I cannot explain, for that it pertaineth to a grade so much more exalted than yours, that you have never even heard the name of it, and I know the plans of the German General Staff in detail." Cyril's tone transformed his Assassine utterance into something too Sibylline, oracular, Delphic, Cumean, that his interlocutor almost trembled. "Vestius ensius patrios dos." By his walk it was clear he was a god, when Cyril thought it necessary to impress the uninitiate. To the majority of mankind, gold looks like dross unless it is wrapped up in tinsel, and tenfold the proper price marked on it in plain figures, with the word sacrifice. Hence it is that the most successful merchants omit the gold altogether. "Oh, I didn't understand. You'll observe that I can't explain this to the Cripps. I shall have to spin some sort of a yarn." Yes. In point of fact, the yarn was already spun. Cyril had not been divining by any means more occult than his innate sagacity, but Lord Juventus was one of those people who bow only before the assumption of authority, supported by mystery and tomfoolery, since their reason is undeveloped. Such people make excellent secondary figures in any campaign, for their confidence in their leaders impresses the outsider who does not know how mentally object they are. It is said that no man is a hero to his valet. On the contrary, every man is a god to his secretary. If not, he had better get rid of the secretary. Lord Juventus could not have followed Cyril's very astute calculations, those which he meant to lay before General Cripps, but he would have staked his life on the accuracy of a tarot divination so obscure that he was not allowed even to hear its nature, and which in fact had not been performed. Indeed, it did not even exist, having been invented on the spur of the moment by the unscrupulous magician. I shall tell him that the military situation is inextricably bound up with political and dynastic considerations. I shall drop a word about Anschauung and Weltpolitik, you know." Lord Juventus giggled adorably. "By the way," continued Cyril, "have you any influence, personal I mean, with the old man?" Lord Juventus bent forward with lowered eyelids, and sank his voice to a confidential whisper. "The day we crossed," he murmured. "Great, but I thought prehistoric is perfectly cocker." Such conversations lacked the merit of intelligibility to the outsider, but then the outsider is particularly to be kept from understanding. Dialogues of this curious sort determine most important events in English society and haute politique. "Then see to it that I get taken seriously." "Surely, Cyril." "Precatora ocularis melitius. Let him pray to the honey-eyed one." Cyril Catul. When Englishmen return to the use of the dead languages, it is a sign of that moral state which is said by the psalmist to resemble the holy oil that flowed down upon the head of Aaron, even unto the skirts of his garment. The orderly called the staff to dinner. Cyril, as the guest of the evening, was on the commander-in-chief's right hand. "You have been very highly recommended to me," said the old cavalry leader when the time came to smoke, "and I look to you to distinguish yourself accordingly. You will be under the orders of Colonel Mavor, of course. You should report to him at once." "May I give you some information direct?" asked Cyril. "The matter hardly brooks delay, as I see it. You should know it at once, and, to be frank, I think this must be my best chance of you ever hearing it." "A damned funny beginning," growled the general. "Well, get on." The permission was not very gracious, but an irregularity is a serious thing in the British Army. General Cripps made bad worse. "Unofficially, mind, absolutely unofficially," he added, before Cyril could begin. "This is the English expedient for listening to anything without hearing it, or saying anything without meaning it. An official conversation cannot be thus sterile. It involves notes, memorandum, dockets, recommendations, reports, the appointment of commissions, interminable deliberations, more reports and questions in Parliament, the introductions of bills, and so on. Nothing is done in the end, exactly as in the case of an unofficial conversation. So you can take your choice, sir, and be damned to you." "Unofficially, of course, General," agreed Cyril. "My object is merely to disclose the plans of the German General Staff." "Thank you, Captain Grey," replied the great man sarcastically. "This will indeed be a service. To save time, begin from Van Klock's occupation of Paris about 4 days hence." Impossible, General. Van Klopp will never capture Paris. Why, the man is actually of plebeian origin. After dinner, but only then. Such observations are in perfectly good taste. Proceed. I'm not joking in the least, General. Von Kluck will not be allowed to try to capture Paris. It is at least curious that he is marching straight upon the city. Only to thin out our line, sir. Do you observe that the Germans have driven a salient to St. Mihiel? I have. What of it? The object, sir, I submit, is to cut off Verdun from the south. Yes. Why Verdun? Because the Crown Prince is at the head of the army which threatens it. Paris will never be taken, but by that modern Caesar. Something in that, I admit. The little beast is certainly unpopular. They are bound to make him the national hero at any cost. And where do we come in? What could be clearer? Their right wing will break through somewhere or roll us up. Verdun will be isolated. The Grand Prince, God bless his noble heart, will walk through and goose-step all the way to Paris. It is the only chance for the Hohenzollern dynasty. 'Tis a military madness. They think they have had enough in hand to risk it. But yes, sir. For God's sake, see the conclusion. If I'm right, Von Kluck is bound to swerve east right across our front, and we'll smash him. He couldn't risk such a crazy manoeuvre. Mark my words, sir, he will. And what do you suggest that I should do about it? Unofficially, Captain Grey, quite unofficially. Get ready to lam it in, sir, quite unofficially. Well, sir, I congratulate you on having talked the most amusing nonsense that I've heard since my last talk with General Buller, and now perhaps you had better report to Colonel Mavor as intelligence officer. The General's tone was contemptuous. Facts are required in this army. Psychological facts are facts, General. Nonsense, sir. You are not in a debating society or a scientific tea party. That last, sir, replied Cyril coldly, is my unavailing regret. But Lord Juventus Miller frustrated the effect of this impolitic speech. He fixed his languid eyes upon the red face of the veteran, and his voice came in a soft, caressing whisper. Pardon me, sir. Do let us be unofficial for 5 minutes more. Well, boy, I think it's only fair to let General Foch enjoy the joke. I hear he has been depressed lately. He might not take it so easily. The French do not care to be played with when their country's at stake. He can only shoot poor Cyril, mon vieux. Just give him 2 days' leave so that he can run over before reporting to Mavor. Oh, well, I dare say the intelligence department can get on without its champion guesser for a day or so. Trot along, Grey, but for your sake I advise you to think up a fact or two. Cyril saluted and took his leave. Juventus came to see him into the car. I'll wheedle the old ass, he whispered to his friend. I'll get him to make such dispositions as he can without disturbing this line too much, so that if Fox should see any sense in your scheme, by any chance, we shan't be too backward in coming forward. Good for you. So long. Ta! Cyril drove off. It was a terrible and ominous journey to the headquarters of General Foch. The line sagged hideously here and there, so that long detours were necessary. The roads were encumbered not only with every kind of military supply, all in disorder, but with fugitive soldiers and civilians, some burdened with their household goods, some wounded, a long trail of agony lumbering to the rear. The country was already patrolled by herds of masterless and savage dogs, reverted in a month of war to the type of the coyote and the dingo. But Cyril shouted in his joy. His confidence rose as he went. He had thought out one of General Cripp's facts, which he felt sure would carry conviction to the mind of the French commander. Arrived at the chateau where the general was quartered, he found no trouble in gaining audience. The Frenchman, splendidly built, his eyes glittering with restless intelligence, concentrated all his faculties instantly on his visitor. You have come from General Cripp's? Yes, my general, but on my own responsibility. I have an idea. Foch interrupted him. But you are in an English uniform, he could not help saying with brisk Gaelic surprise. Cuculus non faciat monachum, retorted Cyril Grey. I am half Scotch, half Irish. Then pray give yourself the trouble to continue. I may premise that I have told my idea to General Cripps. It convinced him that I am an imbecile or a joker. That was his fact, his master argument. It told heavily. The face of Foch grew instantly keen and eager with all expectation. "Let me hear it." The general reached for a memorandum. Grey laughed. In a few words he repeated his theory of the German plans. "But it is certain," cried Foch. "One moment. Excuse me. I must telephone." He left the room. In 5 minutes he was back. "Rest easy, Captain Grey," he said. "We shall be ready to catch Von Kluck as he turns. Now, will you do me the pleasure to take this note back to your chief? The British must be ready to strike at the same moment. I won't ask you to stay, but I beg of you to come to dinner with me after the victory." It is impossible to give any idea of how the word victoire sounds in the mouth of a French soldier. It has in it the ring of a sword thrust home to the hilt, and the cry of a lover as he seizes his mistress, and the exultation of a martyr who, in the moment of his murder, reaches conclusively to God. Cyril went back to the British headquarters and handed in General Foch's request, through Colonel Mavor officially. The events of the next week are of the very spine of history. The cruel blow was definitely parried. More still, that first great victory not only saved France for all time, but showed that the men of Bonaparte had come into their own moral sublimity again. It proved 1870 to have been but a transient weakness, like our own year of shame when Van Tromp swept our ships from the seas. General Cripps summoned Cyril Grey to his quarters. "I'm afraid," said the old man, "that nothing could be done to recognise your services. That your crazy theory should have proved correct is only one more example. We have many such every day, of the operations of the law of chance. The weather forecasters themselves cannot guess wrong every time. But even if your act had merited reward, we should still have been powerless, for, as you remember, our conversation was strictly unofficial. Unofficially, however, you get your step, and the KCB favouritism, sir, rank favouritism. Now go across to General Foch. Major, he wishes to present you to 2 gentlemen named respectively Joffre and Poincaré. Boot and saddle, no time to waste," he said hastily, to check any expression of gratitude. But as the 2 men gripped hands, their eyes were dim. They were thinking of England. So off went Cyril on the road to Paris, where his rendezvous was fixed. The victory had changed the aspect of the country in the rear of the armies as by stagecraft. There was no more fugitives, no more disorder. Still the long trains of wounded clogged the roads here and there, but the infection of glory had spread like sunlight over a sky swept clear of storm. The supply trains radiated confidence. Always the young man met new guns, new wagons, new horses. At every turn of the road were fresh regiments, gaily singing on their way to the front. Cyril was enchanted at the aspect of the troops. The elasticity and high spirits was overwhelming. Once he came upon a regiment of Turcos being transferred to another sector, every man of them with a trophy of the great battle. His intense love for all savage men, true men and spoilt by civilization, almost mastered him. He wanted to embrace them. He saw life as urgent, the menace of the enemy thwarted, and his joy flooded his heart so that his throat caught fire and song leaped to his lips. And then chill caught him as he came suddenly upon a dreadful sight. Before him on the road stood a signpost, the lance of a sapphire, thrust into the bank of a ditch. Now to it was a placard on which was coarsely chalked the one word, Espion. A fatal curiosity drew him to the spot as he approached. The wild dogs that were fighting around the sinister signal fled in terror from their ghastly meal. A sword had been thrust through the belly of the corpse. The tongue had been torn out. One could recognise at a glance the work of Algerian troops, men who had lost a third of their effectives through the treacheries of the German spies. But despite all mutilation, he recognised more than that. He recognised the carcass. This carrion had once been Douglas. Cyril Grey did a strange thing, a thing he had not done for many years. He broke into a strong sobbing. "I know now," he murmured, "that Simon If is right. The way of the Tao. I must follow that harder path, the path where he who would advance draws back." He put spurs on his horse. Half an hour later he saw the sunset glint upon the Eiffel Tower, and on the wings of one of those gallant birds that circled about it to keep watch and ward on Paris. The next morning he reported himself to the British authorities, and it was Lord Anthony Boleyn who presented him to the President and Commander-in-Chief. At the banquet he found himself an officer of the Legion of Honour, but his brilliancy and buoyancy were gone. He dined in full decorum. His thoughts still turned to the shameful corpse in the ditch by the wayside. He excused himself early and left the LC. At the gate stood an automobile. In it sat Lisa Giaffrea. She jumped out and caught him by the shoulders. She poured out the tale of her madness and its results and its cure, her careful tracking of his movements, her determination to recover him at any cost. He listened in silence, the silence of incurable sadness. He shook his head. "Have you no word for me?" she cried impetuously, torn by her agony. "Have you no gift for me?" he answered. She understood. "Ah, you are human! You are human!" she cried. "I do not know what I am," he answered. "Yesterday I saw the end of the game, for one." He told her in a few words of the horror on the roadside. "Go," he said, "take that girl, Douglas's last victim, for your maid. Go to America. Find the child of the moon. There may or there may not be other tasks for us to do. I know not. Time will show." I will, she cried. "I will go now, quickly. Kiss me first." Once again the tears gathered in the magician's eyes. He understood more deeply than he had ever done the sorrow of the universe. He saw how utterly incompatible are all our human ideals with the laws of life. He took her slowly and gently in his arms, and he kissed her. But Lisa did not respond. She understood that this was not the man whom she had loved. This was a man that she had never known, one whom she dared not love, a man set apart, an idea to adore. She knew herself unworthy, and she withdrew herself. "I go," she said, "to seek the child. Hail and farewell." Hail and farewell. The girl mounted unsteadily into her car. Cyril Grey, his head bowed upon his breast, plunged into the wooded pleasaunce of the Champs-Élysées. An ineffable weariness came upon him as he walked. He wondered dully if he was going to be ill. He came up against the obelisk in the Place de la Concorde with a shock of surprise. He had not noticed that he had left the trees. The obelisk decided him. Its shape smote into his soul the meaning of the mysteries of Egyptian magic. It was as invigorating as a cold plunge. He strode away towards Montmartre. The professed house of the order had been converted into a hospital, but who should come to greet him if not Sister Cybele? Beside her stood the severe figure of Simon If. There were two others in the background. Cyril was not surprised to see his old master, the Mahafara Fang, but the other, it was Abdul Bey. "Come forward and shake hands," cried Simon If. "I have not been interactive, Cyril," added the old man. "I have had my eye on our young friend for a long time. I put my hand on him at the right moment. I showed him that spying was a dog's game, with a dog's death at the end of it. He's renounced his errors, and he is now a probationer of our holy order." The young men greeted each other, the Turk stammering out an appeal for pardon, the other laughing off his embarrassment. "But you are ill, Cyril," cried Sister Cybele, and in truth the boy could hardly stand. "Action and reaction are equal and opposite," explained Simon If cheerily. "You will sleep, brother Cyril, and you will then pass 7 days in meditation, in one of the high trances. I will see to the extension of your leave." "There is a meditation," said Cyril firmly, "given by the Buddha, a meditation upon a corpse torn by wild beasts. I will take that." Simon If acquiesced without comprehending. He did not know that Cyril Grey had understood that the corpse of Douglas was his own, that the perception of the identity of himself with all other living things had come to him and raised him to a great adeptship. But there was one to comprehend the nature of that initiation. As Cyril walked, leaning on the arm of Sister Cybele, to the room appointed for his prescribed solitude, he beheld a great light. It shone serenely from the eyes of the Mahafara Fang.